So we're starting today with Saint Ambrose. You should know that Ambrose becomes one of this group known as the four great Latin doctors of the Church. So we're not going to be able to get into his teaching quite as much, but it's really worth looking at. So four great Latin doctors: Ambrose, Jerome, Augustine, and Gregory the Great. Ambrose, Jerome, Augustine, and Gregory the Great. They're sort of the four hallmarks, these four pillars of Western theology, of Western piety, of Western thought. It's a little bit of a misnomer because there's other ones too that become very important for the Western tradition as you move into the later ages and especially the Middle Ages. It doesn't include Benedict, who's probably one of the most important figures in history. Not so much because he was a great and widely known man himself, but because of the rule that he writes. We'll get to the rule of Benedict, I think, or maybe we covered it already. Lots of the history pieces have become a little bit of soup in my mind because I know I wrote about it, but I have no idea where I wrote about it.
Did you get an A?
Well, I mean, I wrote about it in the notes. So Ambrose is born after the reign of Constantine. You can see that. Constantine, I think, dies by 350, 360, somewhere around there. He's born in the time of the rule of Constantius II. If you remember, I think we talked last time about the bit of mess that happens when after Constantine dies and he divides the empire between his sons, and then they start murdering each other, and pretty soon the whole project of uniting the empire is falling apart again. Ambrose is educated in Rome in Greek and Latin and rhetoric. What is rhetoric?
Speaking.
The art of speaking. The art of speaking. So grammar and rhetoric were two of the signs of a classical education, an education in the strongest sense. I mean, Ambrose's speeches today, even in translation, still ring with a kind of power and authority that few other peoples do. He practiced law for a while and then becomes a Roman governor. He's famous for living in Milan. I don't know if he spends his entire life there, but Ambrose is associated with Milan in a strong way. So he becomes a governor, and their governor died or had to go into exile or something, and they decided, so he becomes this governor. Oh no, it was their bishop who ends up, I think their bishop dies, and they're at his funeral, and the crowd decides that Ambrose should be their new bishop. And so they just sort of shout him down, you will be the new bishop. And at that time, he was only a catechumen, so he wasn't even baptized. It's a little bit strange to invite someone who's not baptized yet to be your bishop. That would be somewhat, I don't know if frowned upon is the right kind of phrase, but in the modern world it would feel different. But it turns out, there's a few cases, you've heard of things like nepotism being a bad thing, because it usually is. The ruler appoints their family members to positions of authority. Or, in this case, inviting a catechumen to become a bishop. That usually wouldn't be a good thing. But there's a few times in history where it turns out that the other direction was completely true. So the most famous example of nepotism in the High Renaissance is St. Charles Borromeo. He becomes the cardinal bishop of Milan, same place of St. Ambrose, because he was a relative of the Pope. And when he was 13 or 14 or something, he was terribly young. But it turned out that in like this almost singular instance, it worked out to the great benefit of the people. It doesn't happen very often, but every once in a while someone comes along and you're like, oh, well, that was nice. Because it turned out that Ambrose was an eminently capable man. They picked maybe one of the best people that they could have to be their new bishop. He was good at administration. He had been a Roman governor. He also had a deep love for theology and learning. So he could guide things well administratively. He could study what was true, and he could also speak about it. It turns out that he has quite a backbone as well, because he's the first bishop to do something kind of outstanding. We'll cover that in just a second. So he's baptized and ordained a priest and then ordained a bishop. He still goes through the whole thing. And after his time, this actually becomes like a protest of the Pope that you can't do this. You can't like baptize someone and then confirm them and then a week later ordain them as a deacon and then a few days after that ordain them a priest and then a few days after that ordain them a bishop. That's not the way that it's supposed to go. But what happens during his time that our author notes is the Western emperor moves his capital or moves his center of administration to Milan. Remember at this time that they're still operating more or less within Diocletian's system. So there's two emperors that are called Augusti, and then there's two sort of vice president people that are called Caesars. And they do this because they want you to beat your head into a wall and never remember who's who and what's what. Because the names become very, very similar after a while. Like there's a Maximian, there's a Maximus, there's a whole stack of people, and it's like, you changed 2 letters from the last guy. It should be illegal. When you're the emperor, you make the laws, so what's illegal doesn't really matter. But Maximian is the emperor of the West at this point, and he moves his residence to Milan. So if you remember, like this is one of the pieces where there's this dramatic shift, because Rome still in Christianity has a kind of central place because of the Pope, because of the death of St. Peter and Paul, but the administrative center, the political center of the Western Empire has moved out, which means that Rome is a city very much in decline. It's not all roads lead to Rome like it used to be, or the center of the known universe, the beating heart of the world, as the Romans thought of it in earlier days. Rome by this point is sort of like, well, yeah, it's on the map, but it's not, it doesn't have the same kind of importance. It would be a similar thing that happened, let's say in the United States. At one point we decided that our capital was too far east and too exposed to stuff from the sea, and so they decided to move the capital of the states to St. Louis. It would take a while, but eventually Washington, D.C. would decline in importance as institutions move, as things move to be with the government. If you started moving all the departments, eventually Washington, D.C. would be a large city without like, okay, yeah, that's nice, but it wouldn't have the same kind of impact. And that's sort of what has happened to Rome by this point. The capital has moved. The capital of the whole empire is in the east, so far in the east, Constantinople. And even, it's not even sort of the residence of the governor of the west kind of thing. It's like, well, yeah, it's there. It's the old capital. Yeah, there's nice stuff, but who cares? The center becomes Milan. And because of this proximity, Ambrose becomes more of a public figure. In his case, he doesn't want political authority. He's not in it for politics. He's just trying to minister to his flock. It just so happens that his flock rose in importance, and so did he. But he does become a bit of a public figure because by this time the empire is formally on its way to becoming Christian. That will happen in the time of Theodosius, who comes next. So Theodosius is one of the next. He's in Augustus, so he's one of those chief emperor people. I don't remember if he rules the whole empire or just part of it. But he actually claims to be, sort of is, a pious Christian who has grouchy moments and kills people, but pious Christian. But then he does something that I think is one of the great questions of history that should be debated. Because he decides that Nicene Christianity, so this Christianity of the councils, is going to be the official religion of the empire. Which sounds nice if you're a Nicene Christian, but remember, most of the people at this time, or at least many, if not most of the bishops, are still sort of practicing Arians. So there's still, some of them are moving in the right direction, but Arianism was the heresy where they believed that Jesus wasn't God, that he's like a lesser being of some kind that isn't super clear. It's an emphasis more so on his humanity, you could say. So he issues a decree that Nicene Christianity is going to be the official religion of the empire, and I think he makes paganism illegal again. And this is a point about which I think we could disagree as Christians, but this is a fascinating time to consider even in our own age, because this question of how the relationship between church and state should work is boiling at this point in the Roman Empire, because the emperor naturally thinks himself as head of everything. He's the emperor. What he says is law. What he says goes. That's the way it is. The Christians, I wonder what it was like for them. I mean, they would much more naturally fit into that system. They're living in a world where rulers rule by divine right. Like, this is something given to them by God, particularly when they're Christian. And so to act against the ruler is to act against God. We have a very different view of political authority now. But it's important to see that there is a sea change. Like, we don't live on the same continent or even the same planet when it comes to our understanding of politics and the human person and things like democracy. Democracy at this time in history would have probably gotten you killed as a treasonous heretic. Like, that was not kosher. That is not the way it worked. Maybe in ancient Rome, democracy wasn't so bad, but even their democracy wasn't like ours. In their democracy, people got to vote, but only people with land and property counted. It was very different. So, is it a good thing? Is it a good thing to unite the power of the church and the state? In some ways, you could say yes. It allows churches to be opened. It starts putting more pressure on those who are practicing these other kinds of religion to begin converting. They're on the political outs. And in other ways, it makes me, I suspect it makes a lot of you a little bit uncomfortable, because once it's the official religion, the state starts using coercive authority to make it happen. Is that good? What is the relationship of religion to freedom? And this is something that you have faced very often in a strong way because of raising children. And you start to realize that it kind of doesn't matter what you say. And that's a really, really hard thing. The kids have to choose to embrace it or not. And you can stamp your feet, and you can snort, or you could make every argument in the book. You can offer every kind of consolation and good thing, and they still have to choose it themselves. And that's a hard thing. That's a burden for a lot of parents. It doesn't always go well. So I think it's a good question to sit and consider. What should that relationship be? And like I said, it's okay as Christians, it's maybe even a good thing that we have differences of opinion. You could say religion being united to the state has more benefits than challenges, and this is a good thing. You could say that it's not a good thing and you'd like to have a firmer separation. But regardless, what happens in the West is the same thing that happened in the East with Constantine. They start to see religion as this thing that brings people together. Remember that old idea of the fusion in the Roman mind between religion and politics, how the politicians were religious leaders in paganism? That gets carried over into Christianity somewhat. So religion is this unifying force. To be Roman, to be part of the empire, becomes linked with this idea of being a Nicene Christian. What we would call Orthodox Christianity, Christianity with right belief. They're following the councils. But it's at best, I would say, an uneasy truce. So one of the rather funny things, and this is a great story. I mean, this is a mark of the man. So in the time of St. Ambrose, it's really, really important to have local martyrs who are like the patrons of your place. And Rome had lots of martyrs. Remember, that's where the earlier persecutions were. And so Rome has lots of martyrs. They have lots of bodies of saints. It's like Ambrose in Milan hears his people say, well, we need our own saints, not those Roman, people over there. We want our saints. And so Ambrose begins to pray about it. And this is one of the great stories, I think, of the inspiration of the Lord. But it also shows how important devotion to the saints was. This was not just, it'd be nice to have some saints. This is kind of like our church doesn't survive because they're all going to go down to Rome and, give the Romans their money and give the Romans their offering and go pray at Roman churches. We need our own martyrs. So he prays and has a dream of these two martyrs, Gervasius and Protasius, who show him where their tomb is. And then they dig down and find it. So he finds the bodies of these martyrs where he has, I think it's in a dream. It's a dream or a vision. But he finds the bodies of these martyrs where he has this vision. And so he's like, we got our martyrs. And so throws this giant public celebration. They have a procession. They carry their bodies into the cathedral. This is a big deal. Ambrose writes a treatise on virginity. He writes something on common prayer. He preached regularly and eloquently. He was famous because he would take little tunes that people had heard in other places, like plays, and he would write Christian lyrics for them. He's a very good poet. Ambrose's poetry, many of his hymns are actually still sung today in translation. And I don't know any offhand, but there's some very, very nice ones. I think one of his hymns, a famous Latin song that is used for night prayers, Te lucis ante terminum, to you, Lord, at the evening of the day, would be something of the translation. And I think that's one that he wrote. So he was the kind of guy that would probably drive you crazy because the kids would come to the cathedral and he'd teach them to sing. And he'd teach them to sing these songs with short little verses and are afraid that they'd repeat over and over and over and over and over again. And then when you were tired of it, they'd keep singing it because Ambrose told them to. But he did that as a way of sort of bringing these beliefs of Nicene Christianity to more of his people. So he wasn't above using a bit of gentle coercion himself. He teaches the kids the songs and they learn them and sing them. Think a little bit like Frozen. Lots of you probably know some of the songs from Frozen because if you have a granddaughter you got exposed to them for like 5 years, every day. And some of those are actually pretty good pieces of music, but they're very, very catchy, and that was part of the success of that movie. Think of Ambrose being kind of like that, and you're a bit close to the truth. But what it's going to set up is this massive conflict with the emperor. So Justina is the mother of Valentinian II. Remember I told you the names were going to be kind of crazy? Like there's a Valentius, there's a Valentinian, and a whole bunch of other people that start with V as well. It's like we should just rename them all and make them go in alphabetical order. So you get to be the A emperor, and then you're the B emperor, and you know, so that you could figure out if their name started with Z, you knew that they weren't close to the beginning, they were close to the end. But she rules over the East, and she is an Arian and wants to enforce Arian Christianity. And so the Arians in the capital in Milan demand a church for their celebrations. And the empress demands that Ambrose give up a church. Now, again, this is a little bit, this makes me a little bit uneasy, because is it right for Ambrose to say they shouldn't have a place to worship? It's kind of like, no, it's our church. We can't give it to them. They're heretics. What are you talking about? And I think in the modern world we might decide that this isn't so bad because we have a different perspective on the freedom of religion. Can you use political force to keep these churches? Because in a lot of cases, they were not asking for the biggest, nicest churches. When they asked for his cathedral, he said, absolutely not. I'll hit you with my stick. They were going to give him another church. They were going to actually make it really nice, but he says no. The emperor then claims, it's my church. I'm the emperor. I built it, so it's mine, and I can give it to whoever I want. You have to leave. Which, again, in American law, probably would be more true than false. Ambrose is like, no. He replies that the things of God are not subject to the authority of the emperor. Buzz off. So he basically decides to lock himself and a bunch of people in the church and keep preaching and celebrating masses so that the soldiers can't come and take it. You would think that this is going to be frowned upon. And so the emperor sends troops on Holy Thursday. Now, if you were an emperor, this might not be the best day to decide to try and take a church from the Christians. So he basically says no, and they have people like holding the doors shut to lock the soldiers out of the church. It's good that it doesn't turn into a mess where a bunch of people get murdered. But Ambrose is like, no compromise with heresy, no compromise with the emperor, I don't care. And eventually the emperor backs down. Now in the West, this is like the dinging of a bell that's heard around the world. This is something that puts a flag in a fork in the road, and history changes on this kind of moment. Because it's the first time that an emperor has been told no by someone, and they stuck to it, and the emperor is the one who backs down. And so the Christian bishops are like, hey, this is how this works. You know, churches are ours, you stay away. Now note that that doesn't happen in the East. This is part of that East-West divide and the tension. In the East, Constantinople, the emperor has a lot more authority. If he decides to give a church to the heretics, that's the way it goes. But in the West, Ambrose establishes this precedent that emperors and political authority do not rule over churches. And this is something that Western bishops will cling to all the way until things like the Peace of Westphalia and the end of the 100 Years' War in the Reformation. Like, no, the church things are church things, and you as political people have to stay out. Now, it's not always true everywhere, but this sets a precedent that the Western Christians will appeal to for more than 1,000 years. In fact, people still do today. And it could have gone very badly for Ambrose. I mean, note, the soldiers could have decided to just kill everyone in the church. That would not have played well for them. They would have been in big trouble. There's things that an emperor can do, but again, there are limits on authority. It'd be sort of like if the Chinese decided to rise up against the communists, and they actually did it. This is part of the reason that the communists are paranoid. They can't kill them all. You can't shoot a crowd of, 1 billion people. Because no matter what you think, if you kill that many people, your political future is done. Even if you kill, 10 or 15,000, your political future goes out the window before you snap. Because you will, one of the things that has happened, for instance, in our own day, when the Russians invaded the Ukraine, they de-Russianized the Ukraine in a way that never would have happened had they not. For much of history after the fall of communism, Ukraine has been kind of this corrupt middle ground between the old guard in places like Russia and Europe. And more of the young people wanted a European direction. More of the old people with ties to communist rule want more of a Russian connection. And when the Russians invaded, the Ukrainians united around a national identity. So much so that if you look at some of the things that have happened, they had this giant statue of the victor, I forget what it's called, but it's like this giant statue of a woman holding a shield with a giant sword. I think the thing is like bigger than the Statue of Liberty by an order of magnitude or two. Like giant statue, and on the shield that she was holding was the hammer and the sickle of communism, until the Russians launched their invasion. And then the Ukrainians took it off and replaced it with a symbol from the Ukrainian armed forces. The Russians managed to de-Russianize Ukraine in a way that has not happened. As soon as they invaded, all of a sudden they're like, wait a minute, this is our land. And they crystallize around an identity, and now, it's illegal to speak Russian in much of the Ukraine. You get arrested. Maybe that's going too far, but that's how far the pendulum has swung. Before the war, over 50% of the households in the Ukraine spoke Russian as their daily language. And after it, I think Russian is actually illegal in parts of the Ukraine. So, it's the same kind of thing that plays out here. If the emperor would have just sort of taken an old church or an old building and given it to the Arians, it probably would have been fine. But when he meets Ambrose, Ambrose digs in, and with him, all of the people do as well. They sort of organize a sit-in. Like, if you want the church, you're going to have to murder us all. And all of a sudden, it's like that external action forces an identity crisis in a good way. Sometimes identity crises are helpful because the Christians are like, no, we're Christians. You are an emperor and you can stay away. So there's also this conflict with the pagans that's happening. Some people still want to worship the old gods, and one could ask a question. Should they? Should paganism be illegal? And if so, why? I would think that one could make an argument very, very well that in large part it should depend a little bit on what kind of paganism. I don't really have a problem with people outlawing like child sacrifice or human sacrifice or outright murder. But again, this is that fusion of church and state. And is it a good thing? It's hard to say. You could say this is what they did, but it kind of doesn't work because of the same sort of thing. As soon as you make it illegal, the people dig in against you. As soon as it becomes like, you can't do that, we're going to arrest you, It becomes this thing of secret societies and mystique, and all of a sudden, people that weren't very committed pagans before become firmly entrenched pagans afterwards. And some pagans were arguing against Christianity, sometimes well. You know, they'd say, Christians, you preach this, your emperor does this, you don't rebuke him. But even paganism at that time has changed. So one of the gods that sort of comes to the fore now is the god or goddess Victoria, which in English would be victory. Like, that's sort of a strange thing. Like, if they're a god, aren't they supposed to always be a god? And if they're not a god, they weren't a god before? I don't know. Again, this is our perspective in the modern world. But in the Roman world, they're like, nope, goddess victory. Been there all along. I don't know what you're talking about. It's like, well, you only started talking about her like 10 years ago. Yep, been there all along. I don't know what you're talking about. So, Ambrose, again, there's this destruction of a pagan altar at the Senate. And the emperor wants to replace it because it was there before. And Ambrose says, no, you should not replace it. Again, this is that kind of fusion between religion and politics that is sticky. I don't know that there's an easy answer for this or a good answer, but it's like, should they do that? What is part of history? What isn't part of history? If you put it there, will people use it? Do you mean for them to use it? Can you restore, for instance, a pagan temple so people can look at what it looks like without attracting them toward paganism? There's lots of questions that surround this. And then the problem sort of magnifies because that uneasy relationship also exists between Christianities and Jews. If it's illegal for the pagans, what about the Jewish people? Are synagogues illegal? And in history, at this time, the large answer becomes yes. Yes, actually they are. And you have major Christians who argue against it. So the Christians burned down a synagogue in a city called Callinicum, something like that. And the emperor orders the bishop to rebuild the synagogue, which, again, you know, in the interest of justice, that doesn't seem to be too far off the mark. Your people burned it down. They weren't supposed to do that. At this time, that was actually illegal. So you have to pay to put up a new one. And Ambrose again says, no. You can't force Christians to put up a non-Christian building. In this case, even a Jewish one. Ambrose likens it to an attack on the God of... Oh wait, no, that was the wrong section. He talks about this as a church being forced to build a space for a rival religion. And again, the emperor gives in. So Ambrose is kind of like, he's sort of the